Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most fascinating yet brutal stories, the everyday reality of being a soldier in Napoleon's Grande Armée. These were ordinary young men who marched across an entire continent, facing challenges that would break most of us today. From frozen wastelands to scorching deserts, from the muddy fields of Prussia to the burning sands of Egypt, their story is one of incredible endurance, ingenuity, and sometimes heartbreaking tragedy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When you think of Napoleon's army, you might imagine grand military parades, eagles gleaming in the sun, and the thunder of cavalry charges. But for the average soldier, life was less about glory and more about how do we not perish tonight. It wasn't just a job, it was a test of endurance that came around every day, like an especially cruel teacher who didn't believe in second chances. Picture this, you're living in a tent made of thin canvas, with walls so flimsy you could probably hear a mouse sneeze from outside. No insulation, no proper bedding, unless you count a worn blanket shared with 3 other men. And definitely no escape from the weather that seemed determined to end you. The inside temperature of your shelter was usually just a polite couple of degrees above whatever nature was throwing at you outside. If it was freezing outdoors, it was politely slightly less freezing inside. Congratulations. Nights were the worst. Darkness swallowed everything, the cold crept into your bones like an unwelcome visitor, and sleep became a luxury you could barely remember. If you were on the front lines, sorry. You might as well have been camping in the middle of a nightmare, with worse food. Uniforms weren't much help either. Soldiers didn't get fancy wool coats that actually fit or boots that kept their feet dry. You had a rough blue coat that started falling apart after the first month, maybe a pair of trousers that had seen better days, and a hope that marching 20 miles a day would keep you warm enough not to freeze. Spoiler, it didn't really work, and forget about getting replacements. Supplies were often nothing more than promises written on paper, maybe with a few mouldy biscuits thrown in for good measure, and bonus, some lice for extra company. Luxury. Thy name is soldier life in Napoleon's army. The exhaustion wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Typhus, dysentery, and general wearing down were constant risks, especially for young recruits and veterans who'd been marching for years. Every morning that you woke up still breathing was considered a minor miracle, and honestly worth celebrating, maybe with a slightly less frozen piece of bread for breakfast. So yes, surviving in Napoleon's army wasn't about comfort. It was about gritting your teeth, wrapping every piece of cloth you owned around yourself, marching with feet that had forgotten what it meant not to hurt, and praying you didn't wake up as another casualty statistic. And the real adventure, it was just beginning. If you think your local recruitment office is pushy, Napoleon's conscription system would like a word. Their methods weren't just aggressive, they were basically very enthusiastic people, collecting with a government seal. Most young men weren't exactly lining up to join what historians politely call the Grande Armée. Translation: getting grabbed off the street, handed a musket and told congratulations, you're now property of the French Empire. Yes, property. They weren't trying to be subtle. The government needed bodies, lots of bodies, and they were always readily available, shall we say. These recruitment methods, no matter how lovingly described in propaganda, didn't stand much chance against a young man's desire to keep all his limbs attached. The conscription lottery was the stuff of nightmares. Every year, young men aged 20 to 25 had to register. The unlucky ones whose numbers came up were suddenly soldiers, whether they wanted it or not. Villages had quotas to fill, and local officials got creative when volunteers were scarce. Nothing says pleasant evening like the mayor's men showing up at your door. And then there were the replacements. Rich families could buy their sons out of service by paying someone else to go. Glass was so expensive that even a merchant probably couldn't afford to lose his heir. And peasants, they were just happy if they didn't get selected in the first lottery. To make matters worse, married men were initially exempt, leading to a suspicious surge in weddings across France. When the authorities caught on and changed the rules, you needed to have been married for at least a year. Suddenly, every young man in France developed a deep, immediate interest in long-term commitment. The desperation was real. Some men shot themselves in the foot, literally. Others knocked out their own teeth, the ones needed to tear open powder cartridges. The authorities' response? Execution for self-mutilation, or if you were lucky, being forced into service anyway with your self-inflicted wounds as a permanent reminder of your failed escape attempt. But Napoleon wasn't the type to take no for an answer. His recruiters scoured the countryside like human vacuum cleaners, sucking up vagrants, unemployed workers, and anyone who looked vaguely military age. Training was what you might generously call basic. If you were recruited in the early years, you might get 3 whole months of learning to march, shoot, and not accidentally bayonet your fellow soldiers. By 1812, when Napoleon needed bodies faster than a factory needed parts, training shrank to maybe 2 weeks. 2 weeks to transform Jean the baker's son into a killing machine. It went about as well as you'd expect. Picture a drill sergeant trying to teach complicated military maneuvers to men who'd never travelled more than 10 miles from their villages. Most recruits couldn't read, so written instructions were useless. Everything had to be demonstrated over and over while officers screamed in military terminology that might as well have been ancient Greek. Form square, present arms, fix bayonets. To a farm boy from Provence, it all sounded like angry nonsense. The musket training was particularly special. These weapons were about as accurate as throwing a rock while blindfolded and dizzy. At 100 yards, you had maybe a 1 in 5 chance of hitting what you aimed at. The solution? Don't aim. Just point in the general direction of the enemy and fire when ordered. Volley fire, they called it. Spray and pray, the soldiers called it. Loading a musket involved 12 separate steps that had to be performed in order, quickly, while people were shooting at you. Bite the cartridge, pour powder down the barrel, ram the ball home, prime the pan, and try not to blow your own face off in the process. Veterans could do it in under a minute. New recruits, they'd be lucky to manage it in 3, assuming they didn't drop everything when the first cannon went off. Bayonet training consisted mainly of stabbing straw dummies and trying not to impale your training partner. The instructors would yell about the importance of cold steel, how the bayonet was the queen of battles. What they didn't mention was that most soldiers would never actually use their bayonets in combat. Battles were usually decided by artillery and musket fire long before anyone got close enough for stabbing. Every recruit was promised a smart blue uniform that would make them look like proper soldiers of the Empire. What they actually got was whatever the quartermasters could scrounge up. If you were very lucky, your coat might actually be blue. More likely it was some shade between grey and brown, pre-aged with mysterious stains. The standard issue included 1 coat, 2 shirts, 2 pairs of trousers, 1 pair of shoes, and various accessories like belts and cartridge boxes. Sounds reasonable until you realise this had to last you for your entire term of service. No replacements unless you could prove your old uniform had been destroyed in battle, and good luck getting that paperwork approved while you're marching through Prussia. The quality was exactly what you'd expect from the lowest bidder. Coats that started falling apart after the first rain, trousers that split at the seams if you bent too quickly. Shoes, and I use that term loosely, that seemed designed to cause maximum foot misery in minimum time. After a month of campaigning, most soldiers looked like walking quilts, their uniforms a patchwork of different fabrics stolen, bought, or cut from the uniforms of the fallen. Boots deserved their own circle of hell. The standard military boot was supposedly designed for marching. In reality, it was designed by someone who had never walked farther than from their desk to the wine cabinet. Made from the cheapest leather available, often not properly cured, they would either be too stiff to walk in or fall apart completely within weeks. Soldiers learned to wrap their feet in rags, stuff straw in their boots for insulation, or simply go barefoot when the pain became unbearable. The lucky ones might acquire better equipment from the unfortunate. After a battle, the living would strip the dead of anything useful. Better boots, less torn coats, cleaner shirts. It sounds ghoulish, but when you're choosing between sentiment and survival, survival usually wins. Veterans became experts at battlefield scavenging, knowing exactly which items were worth taking, and which would just add weight to an already overwhelming load. If Napoleon's army had a motto, it would have been, "We walk everywhere all the time until our feet are just memories of pain." The Grande Armée was built on the principle of rapid movement. Napoleon won battles by showing up when nobody expected him, which meant his soldiers had to move faster than anyone thought humanly possible. A typical day started before dawn. The drums would sound at 3 or 4 in the morning, echoing through the camp like the world's worst alarm clock. No snooze button, no 5 more minutes. You stumbled out of wherever you'd been trying to sleep, packed your gear in complete darkness, and formed up with your unit while still trying to remember your own name. Breakfast? That's cute. Maybe if you were lucky you'd gnaw on a piece of yesterday's bread while walking. The column would start moving as the first light touched the sky, thousands of feet beginning their daily torture session. The pace was relentless. Standard march speed was about 3 miles per hour, maintained for 8 to 10 hours a day. Do the math, that's 24 to 30 miles every single day. But that was just the average. During emergency maneuvers, units might cover 40 miles in a day. 40 miles carrying a pack that weighed 60 pounds, wearing boots that were actively trying to destroy your feet, on roads that were often just suggestions of where a road might be nice to have someday. The formation had to be maintained no matter what. You marched in column, 4 or 6 men wide, stretching for miles along the road. If you fell out due to exhaustion or injury, you might be left behind. The army couldn't stop for stragglers. Enemy cavalry loved picking off isolated soldiers, and hostile civilians weren't much friendlier, so you kept walking, even when every step felt like stepping on hot knives. Dust was the invisible enemy. Thousands of men, horses and wagons churned dirt roads into fine powder that rose in clouds hundreds of feet high. If you were in the front of the column, you were lucky, just dealing with fresh air and the occasional pothole. Middle of the column, you're breathing dust soup. Back of the column, you're essentially walking through a solid wall of dirt, unable to see more than a few feet, coating your throat, your lungs, everything. Veterans developed a peculiar shuffling gait that conserved energy. New recruits would try to march properly, lifting their feet, maintaining posture. After a few days, they learned. Shuffle, don't lift. Lean forward slightly. Let momentum do the work. Save your energy for staying upright. Singing helped. Every regiment had its songs, from patriotic anthems about the glory of France to crude ditties about what they'd do to the enemy's sisters. The songs weren't just for morale. They helped maintain pace, gave you something to focus on besides the pain, and reminded you that you weren't suffering alone. Thousands of voices raised in song, even if that song was about how much they missed wine and women, created a sense of unity that kept men moving when logic said they should collapse. The official ration for a French soldier was supposed to be 24 ounces of bread, 8 ounces of meat, or 4 ounces of dried vegetables, a small amount of brandy or wine, and some vinegar for preventing scurvy. In theory, this was adequate nutrition. In practice, getting even half of this was considered a good day. The bread, when it arrived, had usually been baked weeks ago and transported hundreds of miles in conditions that would make a modern health inspector faint. It arrived hard as wood, often mouldy, sometimes with bonus protein in the form of weevils. Soldiers would soak it in water or wine to make it chewable, scrape off the obvious mould, and try not to think too hard about what they were eating. Meat was an adventure in itself. The beef and pork were preserved in salt, so much salt that eating it was like chewing on a salt lick that had once been near a cow. You had to soak it for hours to make it edible, assuming you had water to spare and time to wait. Fresh meat was a rare luxury, usually only available right after a battle when there were suddenly a lot of horses that no longer needed feeding. But here's where it gets interesting. The supply wagons couldn't keep up with Napoleon's rapid movements. The solution was a system called living off the land, which is a polite way of saying organised theft. Units would send out foraging parties to acquire supplies from local farms and villages. These foragers became very skilled at their job. They knew farmers would hide their food, so they developed techniques. Check under floorboards for hidden grain stores. Look for recently disturbed earth where provisions might be buried. Follow the livestock trails to find where animals had been hidden in the forest. Listen for chickens. Farmers always forgot to silence the chickens. The relationship with civilians was complicated. Soldiers needed food to survive, but taking it meant condemning local families to starvation. Many soldiers later wrote with guilt about the faces of children watching their food being loaded onto army wagons. But the alternative was starving themselves, and in war, survival usually won over conscience. Cooking was communal. Groups of 6 to 8 soldiers would pool their rations and take turns preparing meals. The lucky ones had a small pot or kettle. Others improvised, using helmets, boots that were falling apart anyway, or anything that could hold liquid over a fire. The standard meal was soup, a generous term for hot water with whatever they could throw in it. Potatoes if they were incredibly lucky. mystery vegetables, small pieces of meat that might have been horse, dog, or something best not questioned too closely. During the Russian campaign, the food situation went from bad to catastrophic. Soldiers ate their leather belts and straps, boiled to make a sort of leather soup that provided minimal nutrition and maximum digestive distress. They ate horses that had frozen to death, using swords to hack chunks of frozen meat. They ate dogs, cats, rats, and there were whispered stories of worse things that nobody wanted to confirm. After marching all day and choking down whatever passed for dinner, you'd think soldiers would at least get proper rest. The reality was that accommodation ranged from basic to non-existent, with occasional detours into actively harmful. In friendly territory, soldiers might be billeted in civilian homes. This sounds comfortable until you realise it meant cramming 15 to 20 men into a single room, sleeping on straw if the family could spare it, the floor if they couldn't. The homeowners were required by law to house soldiers, but that didn't mean they were happy about it. Smart soldiers slept in shifts, someone always awake to make sure their host didn't decide to solve their unwanted guest problem permanently. Churches were popular billeting spots, large, usually stone buildings that kept out the worst of the weather. Of course, sleeping in a church meant dealing with the psychological weight of bedding down in a sacred space while carrying the sins of war. Many soldiers reported troubled sleep in churches, whether from guilty consciences or just the echo of every snore bouncing off stone walls. Barns were actually preferred by many soldiers. Yes, you were sleeping with animals, but animals meant warmth. A cow generated a lot of body heat, and if you could tolerate the smell and occasional kick, they made decent sleeping companions. Plus, where there were animals, there might be eggs or milk that could accidentally find their way into a soldier's breakfast. But most nights were spent in the open. Each soldier carried a blanket or greatcoat, and that was your bed, your roof, and your only protection from whatever nature threw at you. Veterans learned to read the ground like a map. Avoid low spots where water collected. Don't sleep under isolated trees that might attract lightning. Find a spot with some wind protection, but not so enclosed that you couldn't escape quickly if needed. In rain, there was no staying dry. Your wool uniform would soak through in minutes, and you'd spend the night shivering in wet clothes that smelled like a wet dog that had rolled in something dead. Soldiers would try to keep their powder dry by wrapping cartridge boxes in whatever waterproof material they could find, often their own shirts, choosing hypothermia over being unable to fight. Winter was its own special hell. Soldiers would dig shallow pits in the snow, line them with pine branches if available, and huddle together for warmth. Body heat was survival. There was no room for modesty or personal space when the alternative was freezing to death. Units would literally pile together like human cordwood, the youngest and weakest in the middle, surrounded by the body heat of their comrades. The lucky ones might have tents, but these were usually reserved for officers. When tents were available for regular troops, it would be one tent for 15 to 20 men. Basic mathematics tells you that doesn't work. The solution was sleeping in shifts or packed so tightly that movement was a group activity. Want to roll over? Better coordinate with 5 other people. Forget enemy bullets or cannonballs. The real killer in Napoleon's army was disease. For every man who died in battle, 2 or 3 died from illness. The conditions were perfect for epidemic. Thousands of unwashed men crowded together, sharing contaminated water, eating spoiled food and living in their own filth. Typhus was the great killer. Spread by lice, which every soldier had, it would sweep through regiments like wildfire. It started with fever and headaches, progressed to delirium and a characteristic rash, and killed about 30% of those infected. Whole units would be combat ineffective not because of enemy action, but because everyone was too sick to march, let alone fight. Dysentery was so common it was just considered part of army life. The infamous Napoleon's Revenge, or the Quick Step as soldiers called it. Contaminated water and spoiled food meant most soldiers spent a significant portion of their service dealing with severe digestive issues. Imagine marching 30 miles while fighting stomach cramps, knowing that showing weakness meant being left behind. The medical response to disease was often worse than the disease itself. Bloodletting was still common practice. Feeling weak from dysentery? Let's drain some blood to balance your humours. Mercury was prescribed for everything from syphilis to stomach aches. The cure might not kill you, but it would certainly make you wish it had. Typhoid fever was another constant companion. Spread through contaminated water, it caused weeks of fever, delirium, and often death. Survivors were weakened for months afterward. Entire campaigns could be derailed because too many men were sick to fight. Napoleon himself said disease had defeated more of his plans than all the coalition armies combined. Venereal diseases were rampant. Soldiers with money would visit brothels in occupied cities. Soldiers without money would make their own arrangements. The army tried to control it by inspecting prostitutes and treating infected soldiers, but the treatments were often barbaric. Mercury injections that caused teeth to fall out, caustic substances that caused more damage than the disease, and public humiliation for those caught infected. Even minor injuries could become fatal. A small cut could become infected and gangrenous within days. Without antibiotics, without proper wound care, without basic hygiene, soldiers watched small wounds slowly kill them. The smell of gangrene became so familiar that veterans could diagnose it from across a camp. Scurvy appeared on long campaigns when fresh food ran out. Teeth would loosen and fall out, old wounds would reopen, and men would become too weak to march. The cure, fresh fruits and vegetables, might as well have been gold for how rarely they were available. After weeks or months of marching, poor food, disease and exhaustion, soldiers would finally face what they'd theoretically been training for: battle. The reality was nothing like the glorious charges depicted in paintings. It was organised murder performed with mathematical precision. The night before a battle, nobody slept. Veterans knew what was coming and spent the time preparing, writing last letters, making peace with their God, or simply sitting in silence. New recruits were usually terrified into insomnia, jumping at every sound, wondering if they'd run when the time came. Officers would move through the camps, checking equipment, offering encouragement, trying to project confidence they might not feel. Morning would come too soon and not soon enough. The drums would beat the generale, calling men to arms. Breakfast was whatever could be quickly swallowed, assuming your stomach could handle food when twisted into knots of fear. Then came the waiting. Armies would deploy slowly, taking hours to arrange themselves into the complex formations that battle required. You'd stand in formation, 3 ranks deep usually, shoulder to shoulder with men you'd march beside for months. The waiting was agony. You could see the enemy army deploying across the field, their flags and eagles matching yours in number if not in detail. Artillery would begin exchanging fire, and you'd watch cannonballs bouncing across the field toward you, trying to judge if they'd pass through your formation or between it. When the order to advance finally came, it was almost a relief. The drums would beat the pas de charge, and thousands of men would step forward in unison. The key was maintaining formation. Individual courage meant nothing if the line broke. You march forward at 75 paces per minute, rifles on shoulders, trying not to think about what was coming. At 200 yards, enemy skirmishers would start picking off officers and sergeants. At 150 yards, you might receive your first volley from the enemy line, watching men around you crumple and fall, but you couldn't stop to help. At 100 yards, you'd receive the order to level muskets. At 75 yards, maybe 50 if your officers were aggressive, you'd fire your volley. The smoke was instant and overwhelming. After the first volley, visibility dropped to almost nothing. You'd reload by feel and training, firing into the smoke where you thought the enemy might be. The noise was beyond description. Thousands of muskets firing, cannons roaring, officers screaming orders, wounded men calling for their mothers, horses screaming, drums beating, your own heartbeat pounding in your ears. If you were very unlucky, it would come to bayonets. Despite all the training, most soldiers had never actually stabbed another human being. The physical sensation of driving steel through flesh and bone, feeling it scrape against ribs, the hot blood on your hands. These were things that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Many admitted later they deliberately missed or struck with the musket butt rather than the bayonet. Cavalry charges were their own special terror. Imagine standing in line as hundreds of horsemen thundered toward you, sabres raised, horses trained to trample anything in their path. The only defence was to form square, a hollow formation with bayonets facing outward. If the square held, cavalry couldn't break it. If it broke, everyone died. The pressure of maintaining formation while every instinct screamed at you to run was almost unbearable. Artillery was the real killer. A single cannonball could tear through an entire file of men, leaving a red mist and scattered limbs. Grape shot, essentially turning cannons into giant shotguns, could clear entire sections of line. The worst was explosive shells that would land among troops and detonate, spreading shrapnel in all directions. There was no defence except luck. If the battle itself was hell, the aftermath was something worse. Fields that had been green in the morning were now carpeted with bodies and parts of bodies. The wounded screamed and moaned, calling for water, for their mothers, for death. The smell, blood, gunpowder, voided bowels, and the beginning of decay was overwhelming. Soldiers would be detailed to collect the wounded, but with primitive medical care and thousands of casualties, many were simply made comfortable and left to die. Priority went to those who might survive and return to service. A shattered arm might get you treatment because you could still march. A gut wound meant you were given some water and left to die as comfortably as possible. The burial details were worse than the fighting. Hundreds or thousands of bodies had to be dealt with quickly before disease spread. Mass graves were dug, and bodies were thrown in without ceremony. In winter, when the ground was frozen, bodies might be stacked and burned. The smell of burning human flesh was something veterans never forgot. Looting the dead was officially forbidden and universally practiced. The dead didn't need money, watches, or good boots. The living did. Officers would turn a blind eye as their men stripped corpses of anything valuable. Enemy dead were fair game, but many soldiers also looted their own fallen comrades, justifying it as preventing the enemy from getting the items. Local civilians would descend on battlefields like vultures once the armies moved on. They'd strip bodies of anything the soldiers missed, pull gold teeth, and sometimes finish off wounded soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. It was brutal, but these civilians had often had everything taken by the armies. The battlefield dead were their only chance to recover some losses. The psychological damage was worse than the physical. Men who survived were broken. They'd seen and done things that haunted them forever. Many never spoke of what happened during the retreat. Others couldn't stop talking about it, reliving the horror over and over. The suicide rate among survivors was extraordinarily high. One of the cruelest aspects of serving in Napoleon's army was the isolation from home and family. Most soldiers were illiterate or barely literate, making communication difficult even when it was possible, and during campaigns it was usually impossible. Letters from home were precious beyond measure. When mail did arrive, which might be months after being sent, men would cluster around anyone who could read, desperate for news. A soldier who received a letter would read it dozens of times until the paper fell apart, then recite it from memory. These letters were shared, passed around, read aloud until everyone knew the contents. One man's news from home became everyone's connection to the world they'd left behind. Writing home was equally challenging. Literate soldiers would charge their comrades to write letters for them, payment in food, tobacco, or favours. But what could you say? The truth. That you were starving, freezing, watching friends die horrible deaths. That you'd done things that would horrify your family. Most letters were formulaic and brief. I am alive and well. Send money if you can. Kiss mother for me. The real feelings, the fear, the hunger, the things they'd seen and done remained unwritten. Many soldiers simply disappeared into the void of war. Families would wait years for news, not knowing if their son, husband, or father was dead, captured, or had deserted and was too ashamed to come home. The army's record-keeping was haphazard at best. Men who died of disease or in minor skirmishes might never be officially recorded as casualties. Some families received notification of death years after it happened. Others never received anything at all. Villages had walls of women dressed in black, not sure if they were widows or just abandoned. Children grew up not knowing if their fathers were heroes or cowards, dead or alive somewhere across Europe. The psychological toll of this isolation was devastating. Young men, many just teenagers, were suddenly cut off from everything familiar. No mother's cooking, no village church bells, no harvest festivals. Instead, they had the rough companionship of fellow soldiers, men who might be dead tomorrow. Many formed intense friendships, brotherhood forged in suffering, replacing lost families with military families. When these friends died, and they died constantly, the grief was overwhelming. Soldiers would risk punishment to recover the bodies of close friends, to give them some kind of burial. They'd keep mementos, a button, a letter, a lock of hair carrying the memory of dead friends across Europe. Some soldiers reported talking to their dead comrades, seeking advice, comfort, or just the illusion of companionship. Let's talk about money, or more accurately the absence of it. A French soldier was supposed to earn about 5 sous per day. Not a fortune, but enough to buy some extra food, maybe some tobacco, send something home to the family. The key word here is supposed to. The French government was perpetually broke, fighting wars on multiple fronts, maintaining an empire that stretched across Europe, dealing with the British naval blockade that strangled trade. There was never enough money. Soldiers might go 6 months without seeing a sou. Pay became a mythical concept, something officers promised but never delivered. When pay did arrive, it was often in the form of paper assignats, which were basically IOUs from a government nobody trusted. These papers were supposedly worth their face value, but try convincing a German merchant to accept French government promises in exchange for bread. The exchange rate, when anyone would accept them at all, was highway robbery. This led to a complex economy of favours and barter. Soldiers would trade services, share rations, exchange looted goods. A man who could read and write might trade letters home for extra food. Someone with cobbling skills would repair boots for tobacco. Medical knowledge, even basic first aid, was worth its weight in gold. Gambling was endemic. With nothing to spend money on even when you had it, soldiers would gamble on anything. Card games, dice. Which raindrop would reach the bottom of the tent first? Entire month's pay, when it finally arrived, could be lost in a single night. Officers tried to ban gambling, but what else was there to do during the endless hours of waiting? Looting became not just accepted, but necessary for survival. After battles, soldiers would strip the dead of money, watches, rings, anything valuable. Enemy dead were fair game, but many also looted their own fallen comrades. Officers turned a blind eye, knowing their men needed whatever they could get to survive. The black market thrived. Soldiers would sell parts of their equipment, their rations, sometimes their weapons, to locals for food or money. This was punishable by death. But when you're starving, future consequences seem less important than immediate survival. Unit quartermasters became either saints, who somehow kept their men supplied, or corrupt kings of their own little economies. Discipline in Napoleon's army was maintained through fear and brutal punishment. The revolution had supposedly done away with the aristocratic brutality of the old royal army, but in practice the methods of maintaining order remained medieval. Minor infractions like being late for formation or having dirty equipment might earn you extra duties or reduced rations, but anything more serious brought out the real punishments. Striking an officer was death. Desertion was death. Looting from civilians in friendly territory was death, though this was rarely enforced. Cowardice in battle was death. Falling asleep on guard duty was death. The army had a lot of capital offences. Execution was usually by firing squad, and your own unit would be forced to watch, sometimes forced to participate. Imagine having to shoot your tent mate because he'd finally had enough and tried to go home. The psychological impact on the executioners was often worse than on the condemned. For non-capital offences there was running the gauntlet. The guilty soldier would be forced to walk between 2 lines of his comrades, who would beat him with sticks or rifle butts as he passed. The severity depended on how much his unit liked him. A popular soldier might get token taps, an unpopular one might not survive. Then there was the wooden horse, a triangular wooden frame that soldiers would be forced to sit astride for hours, sometimes with weights attached to their feet. The pressure on the groin was excruciating. Men would pass out from the pain, only to be revived and put back on. Branding was still used for deserters who were caught and not executed. They'd be branded on the face with a D for deserter, marked forever as a coward. These men could never return to normal society. They were walking reminders of what happened to those who tried to escape. But the most common punishment was simply more misery. Extra marches, reduced rations, assignment to the worst duties. Latrine digging was a favourite. Burial duty was another. Anything that added to the already unbearable burden of military life. The irony was that harsh discipline often created the problems it was meant to solve. Men deserted not because they were cowards, but because the army was unbearable. They stole because they were starving. They fell asleep on guard because they'd been marching for 48 hours straight. Despite the relentless misery, Soldiers found ways to maintain their humanity. Small pleasures became enormously important when everything else was horrible. Tobacco was the universal comfort. A pipe after a long march, a bit of chewing tobacco during battle to calm nerves. Men would trade almost anything for tobacco. When supplies ran out, they'd smoke dried leaves, tea, even horse dung. Anything for the ritual, the few minutes of peace that smoking provided. Alcohol, when available, was medicine, comfort, and courage all in one. Wine rations were supposed to be regular, but like everything else, they were unreliable. When wine or brandy was available, it was carefully rationed, save for special occasions or medical emergencies. Finding a wine cellar in an abandoned house was like finding treasure. Music was everywhere. Every regiment had its unofficial musicians, men who'd carried instruments across Europe despite the extra weight. Drums, fifes, violins, even small pianos appeared in camps. In the evenings, when the marching was done and before exhaustion took over, there would be music. Songs from home, military marches, bawdy tunes that would make a sailor blush. For a few minutes you could close your eyes and be somewhere else. Card games and dice were constant companions. Decks of cards would be treasured, repaired with paper and glue when they wore out, replaced card by card when they were lost. The games were simple, the stakes usually tiny. A button, a bit of tobacco, an extra biscuit. But they provided focus, competition, something to think about besides the misery. Stories were currency. A man who could tell a good story was worth his weight in gold during long marches or endless nights. Tales from home, jokes, even recounting old battles with enough embellishment to make them entertaining. Some soldiers became legendary for their storytelling abilities, able to make men forget their hunger and cold for an hour. Romance, when it happened, was intense and usually tragic. Soldiers would fall desperately in love with local women, knowing they'd have to leave when the army moved on. These brief relationships provided moments of normalcy, of human connection beyond the brotherhood of suffering. Many soldiers left children across Europe, children they'd never meet, never know. Religious comfort was sought by many who'd never been particularly religious before. Chaplains were few, but soldiers would organise their own services, mixing half-remembered prayers with military hymns. Crucifixes and religious medals were carried as talismans. Men who'd laughed at religion in their youth found themselves praying desperately before battles. Getting wounded in Napoleon's army often meant a fate worse than quick death in battle. Medical science was primitive, medical supplies were scarce, and medical practitioners were overwhelmed. Field hospitals were established wherever space could be found. Churches were popular because they were large and stone buildings provided some protection. But churches quickly became charnel houses. Blood soaked into stone floors that would never come clean. The screaming echoed off vaulted ceilings. The smell of death mixed with incense created a uniquely horrible atmosphere. Triage was brutal. Surgeons would quickly examine wounded soldiers, deciding who might survive and who was hopeless. Those deemed savable got treatment. Those deemed hopeless got whatever comfort could be spared, usually just a corner to die in. The criteria were practical. Could this man return to service? If not, why waste resources? Surgery was performed without anaesthesia. At best, you might get a shot of brandy and a leather strap to bite. Then came the saw. Surgeons prided themselves on speed. A good surgeon could amputate a leg in under 2 minutes. The sound of sawing through bone, the screaming, the smell of blood and fear, these haunted everyone who witnessed them. Even if you survived surgery, infection was almost guaranteed. Surgeons didn't wash their hands or instruments. They'd wipe blood off their sores with the same cloth they'd been using all day and move to the next patient. Gangrene was so common it was just expected. The smell of rotting flesh became part of the hospital atmosphere. Men would beg to die rather than face amputation. Others would hide wounds, preferring to die quietly rather than face the surgeon's saw. Some would self-medicate with alcohol until they passed out, hoping to die peacefully in their sleep. The lucky wounded might get invalided home, but this was its own kind of death. A one-armed or one-legged veteran had few prospects in civilian life. Many became beggars, living monuments to the cost of Napoleon's ambitions. Others drank themselves to death, unable to live with their memories and their limitations. Phantom pain tormented amputees. Men would feel their missing limbs, painful sensations from body parts that no longer existed. There was no treatment, no understanding of why it happened. Just another layer of suffering added to already unbearable lives. Head wounds were particularly horrific. Men might survive with pieces of skull missing, brain exposed. They'd suffer personality changes, seizures, constant pain. Many begged their comrades to finish them off, rather than live as broken shells of their former selves. Despite the death penalty, desertion was common. The exact numbers are unknown because the army didn't advertise how many soldiers were running away, but historians estimate that hundreds of thousands of men deserted during the Napoleonic Wars. Desertion took many forms. Some men simply walked away during marches, disappearing into forests or cities. Others used the chaos of battle to vanish. Some faked their own deaths, leaving bloodied uniforms behind and starting new lives. The clever ones deserted in groups, forming bands that could protect each other. The challenge was surviving after desertion. You couldn't go home, the authorities would be waiting. You couldn't stay where you deserted, the army would search. You had to keep moving, living as a vagrant, working when you could, stealing when you couldn't, always looking over your shoulder. Some deserters joined enemy armies. It sounds treasonous. But when you're starving and desperate, nationality becomes less important than survival. Many deserters ended up fighting for whoever would feed them. Others became bandits, using their military training to rob travellers and isolated farms. The psychological toll of desertion was severe. You were marked forever as a coward and traitor. You could never return home, never see your family again. Many deserters reported that the guilt and isolation were worse than anything they'd faced in the army. Some actually returned voluntarily, preferring execution to life as fugitives. Units developed their own methods to prevent desertion. Soldiers would be grouped in messes of 6 to 8 men who were collectively responsible for each other. If one deserted, the others would be punished. This created peer pressure and mutual surveillance. Your messmates would watch you as carefully as any officer. Veterans were mixed with new recruits to prevent mass desertions. New soldiers who might have run together were separated, placed under the watch of men who'd already had their spirits broken. It was harder to desert when you were surrounded by men who'd given up hope of escape. If Russia was frozen hell, Spain was burning purgatory. The Peninsular War from 1808 to 1814 was a different kind of nightmare, one that ate away at the French army like a cancer. Spain was supposed to be easy. Replace the incompetent Spanish monarchy with Napoleon's brother Joseph. Control the country. Use it as a base against Portugal and Britain. Instead, it became the Spanish ulcer, a wound that wouldn't heal, constantly draining French blood and resources. The Spanish didn't fight like other European armies. They used guerrilla tactics, hitting French supply lines, murdering isolated soldiers, then melting away into the population. You never knew who was an enemy. The farmer who sold you food might slit your throat that night. The priest who blessed you might be coordinating ambushes. The atrocities escalated on both sides. Spanish guerrillas would capture French soldiers and torture them to death in ways that defy description. They'd leave the mutilated bodies where other French troops would find them, a warning and a provocation. French soldiers responded with equal brutality, burning villages, executing civilians, committing acts that haunted them forever. The climate was brutal in a different way from Russia. Summer temperatures soared above 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Water was scarce and often controlled by guerrillas. Soldiers in wool uniforms designed for European weather literally cooked inside their clothes. Heat stroke killed thousands. The terrain was a nightmare. Mountains that seemed designed to break armies. Roads that were barely goat paths. Rivers that were either raging torrents or dried beds depending on the season. Every march was agony. Every supply convoy a potential death trap. Disease thrived in the Spanish heat. Malaria, yellow fever and other tropical diseases unknown in northern Europe devastated French units. Entire regiments would be combat ineffective, not from enemy action but from fever. The medical corps, already inadequate, had no idea how to treat these new ailments. The psychological warfare was devastating. Soldiers couldn't sleep, knowing that any night might bring guerrilla attacks. They couldn't trust anyone, couldn't relax, couldn't let their guard down for a moment. The stress drove men insane. Suicide rates in Spain were higher than anywhere else. Even victories felt like defeats. You'd take a town after brutal fighting, only to find it empty of supplies, its wells poisoned, its population fled. You'd control the ground you stood on and nothing else. The moment you moved on, the guerrillas would return. When campaigns ended for the winter, armies would go into winter quarters, supposedly a time to rest and recover. In reality, winter quarters were often just a different kind of misery. Soldiers would be billeted in towns and villages, crammed into homes whose owners didn't want them. 20 men might be quartered in a house meant for a family of 5. They'd sleep in barns, attics, cellars, anywhere that had a roof. Privacy was non-existent, comfort impossible. The locals hated them. These were occupying troops eating their food, taking up their space, sometimes taking their daughters. The tension was constant. Soldiers slept with weapons close, knowing that their hosts would happily murder them given the chance. Food was supposedly easier to obtain in winter quarters, but this depended entirely on location. In rich areas of Germany or northern Italy, soldiers might eat well. In poor areas of Poland or Spain, they'd starve just as badly as on campaign, but now they were starving in one place, watching the same civilians they were stealing from slowly starve as well. Boredom was a killer. After months of constant marching and fighting, suddenly having nothing to do drove men crazy. Gambling reached epidemic proportions. Fights broke out over nothing. Alcohol consumption, when alcohol was available, skyrocketed. Men who'd stayed sane through battle went mad from inactivity. Disease spread even faster in winter quarters than on campaign. Hundreds of men crammed into small spaces, sharing air, sharing diseases. Typhus would race through billeted units. Respiratory infections were constant. The death rate in winter quarters was often higher than during summer campaigns. Training was supposed to happen, but it rarely did effectively. Officers were often absent, enjoying better quarters in larger towns. Sergeants were left to maintain discipline, but without the immediate threat of battle, discipline collapsed. Units that had been effective fighting forces in autumn would be mobs by spring. Veterans of multiple campaigns were different creatures from the eager recruits who joined years before. They'd been hollowed out by experience, turned into something that was barely human anymore. Physically, they were wrecks. Years of marching had destroyed their feet and backs. Poor nutrition had led to scurvy, rickets, and other deficiency diseases. Most had chronic dysentery. Many were missing fingers, toes, ears from frostbite. Battle wounds that hadn't healed properly left them in constant pain. Psychologically, they were even more damaged. They'd seen too much, done too much, lost too much. They had what we'd now recognise as severe PTSD, but there was no understanding or treatment then. They self-medicated with alcohol when available, suffered in silence when it wasn't. These veterans, called grognards, grumblers, by Napoleon, were the backbone of his armies. They could march when others collapsed, fight when others ran, endure what would break normal men. But they were also used up, burned out. They continued not from loyalty or patriotism, but because they didn't know how to do anything else. They were brutal mentors to new recruits. They'd teach survival skills, but with a callousness that shocked newcomers. They'd casually discuss eating rats or stripping the dead while young soldiers looked on in horror. They'd lost the ability to see these things as abnormal. Relationships were impossible for them. They couldn't connect with civilians who hadn't shared their experiences. They couldn't maintain friendships when everyone they cared about kept dying. They couldn't love when they knew loss was inevitable. They became emotional islands, isolated even in crowds. Many couldn't adjust to civilian life when they finally left service. They'd been transformed into instruments of war and couldn't transform back. They'd drift from job to job, drink themselves to death, or simply disappear. The suicide rate among veterans was astronomical. By 1813, Napoleon's military machine was falling apart. The disasters in Russia and Spain had destroyed not just armies, but the entire system that created them. The new recruits were younger and younger. By 1813, boys of 16 were being conscripted. These weren't soldiers, they were children in uniforms. They didn't have the physical strength for campaigning, or the emotional maturity for combat. They broke quickly and completely. Equipment was running out. There weren't enough muskets, so some units were armed with pikes. Uniforms were whatever could be cobbled together. Boots were a luxury. The impressive appearance of the Grande Armée was replaced by ragged mobs that looked more like bandits than soldiers. Horses were almost extinct. The cavalry, once the pride of the army, was reduced to fighting on foot. Artillery couldn't move their guns. Supply wagons couldn't keep up with even the slow pace of exhausted infantry. The mobility that had been Napoleon's greatest advantage was gone. Morale had collapsed completely. Soldiers no longer believed in victory, in Napoleon, in anything except survival. Desertion was epidemic. Entire units would simply disappear overnight. Officers couldn't maintain discipline because they shared their men's despair. The enemy had learned. The coalition forces had studied Napoleon's tactics and developed counters. They avoided battle when he was present, attacked when he wasn't. They targeted French supply lines, knowing the army couldn't feed itself. They offered amnesty to deserters, bleeding away French strength. Even Napoleon seemed to have lost his touch. The genius who had dominated European warfare for 15 years was making mistakes, taking unnecessary risks, refusing to accept reality. His marshals were exhausted, his generals incompetent or dead. The entire command structure was rotting. The Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, the Battle of the Nations, was where Napoleon's army effectively died. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a complete collapse of everything that had made the Grande Armée great. The numbers alone were staggering. Nearly 600,000 soldiers involved, the largest battle in European history before World War I. Napoleon's forces were outnumbered almost 2-1. His soldiers were exhausted before the battle even began, having marched and fought continuously for months. For 3 days the battle raged around Leipzig. French soldiers fought with desperate courage, knowing that defeat meant the end of everything. But courage wasn't enough anymore. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and out of hope. When the bridge over the Ulster River was blown prematurely, thousands of French soldiers were trapped. Many drowned trying to swim across. Others were captured. Some fought to the death rather than surrender. The retreat became a rout, every man for himself, discipline completely gone. The aftermath was catastrophic. 90,000 French casualties, dead, wounded, or captured. Entire corps ceased to exist. The army that limped back to France was a shadow of what had crossed into Germany earlier that year. It wasn't even really an army anymore, just scattered groups of exhausted men trying to get home. Napoleon's return from exile in 1815 and the 100 Days campaign was the final agony of his military system. Veterans rallied to him one last time, not from enthusiasm but from habit. They knew how it would end, but they came anyway. The army assembled for the Waterloo campaign was a pale imitation of the Grande Armée. Many veterans were crippled by old wounds. New recruits were barely trained. Equipment was whatever could be scraped together. It was an army held together by nostalgia and desperation. Waterloo itself was fitting end. Fought in mud and rain, with exhausted soldiers who'd been marching and fighting for days. Mistakes piled on mistakes. The old guard, Napoleon's last reserve, his unbeatable elite, broke and ran. When the guard broke, everyone knew it was over. The retreat from Waterloo was the final humiliation. No organised withdrawal, just panicked flight. Soldiers threw away weapons, abandoned wounded comrades, thought only of escape. The mighty Grande Armée, which had once made Europe tremble, dissolved into a mob of desperate fugitives. For the soldiers who survived, coming home was often harder than war itself. They returned to a France that had been defeated, occupied, and humiliated. The glory they'd been promised had turned to ash. Physically, they were ruins, missing limbs, chronic diseases, premature aging from years of hardship. A 25-year-old veteran might look 50. They needed medical care that didn't exist, pensions that were never paid, support that wasn't coming. Economically, they were disasters. Years of military service had left them without civilian skills. They couldn't farm, couldn't work trades, couldn't do anything except march and fight. Many became beggars, living on the streets of the cities they'd once conquered in imagination. Socially, they were outcasts. Civilians couldn't understand what they'd been through. Families had moved on, thinking them dead. Wives had remarried. Children didn't recognise them. They were strangers in their own homes, speaking a language of war that nobody wanted to hear. Psychologically, they were shattered. Nightmares, flashbacks, inability to adjust to civilian life. They'd drink to forget, but alcohol only made the memories more vivid. Many committed suicide, choosing death over living with what they'd become. The government abandoned them. The Bourbon Restoration wanted to forget Napoleon's wars. Veterans were reminders of a past France wanted to erase. Promises of land and pensions were broken. Men who'd given everything for France were left with nothing. Some veterans formed communities, little colonies of the damned where they could be among others who understood. They'd gather in taverns, telling and retelling stories of campaigns, battles, moments when they'd mattered. These stories grew with each telling, becoming legends that bore little resemblance to the horror they'd actually lived. The human cost of Napoleon's wars is almost impossible to calculate accurately, but historians have tried. The numbers are staggering and heartbreaking. France lost between 1.5 and 2 million military dead. Not wounded, not missing, dead. This from a nation of about 30 million people. Nearly every family in France lost someone. Some villages lost entire generations of young men. But death in battle was actually the minority. Disease killed perhaps 3 times as many as combat. Typhus, dysentery, typhoid, pneumonia, infected wounds. For every man killed by an enemy bullet, 3 died of illness. The wounded who survived were uncountable. How do you count a man missing an arm? A man whose lungs were destroyed by pneumonia? A man whose mind was broken by what he'd seen? Hundreds of thousands of men returned home permanently damaged. The demographic impact lasted generations. France lost a significant portion of its young male population. Birth rates plummeted. Economic productivity collapsed. Entire regions were depopulated. The social fabric of France was torn apart. Other nations suffered similarly. Russia lost perhaps 500,000 soldiers. Austria lost 400,000. Prussia, Spain, the various German states, all paid in blood for Napoleon's ambitions. The total military dead from the Napoleonic Wars probably exceeded 3.5 million. Civilian deaths are even harder to calculate. Starvation from armies stealing food, disease spread by moving armies, murders by desperate soldiers, deaths from economic collapse. Perhaps another 3 million civilians died as direct or indirect results of the wars. The weapons and equipment of Napoleon's era were perfectly designed to maximize suffering. They were just advanced enough to kill efficiently, but not advanced enough to kill cleanly. The musket was a terrible weapon. Effective range of maybe 100 yards, accuracy that was laughable, reliability that was questionable. But what it lacked in precision, it made up for in brutality. A musket ball didn't make a clean hole. It shattered bones, tore huge wounds, carried pieces of uniform into the body that guaranteed infection. Artillery was worse. Solid cannonballs would bounce through formations, taking off legs, crushing torsos, turning men into red mist. Grapeshot turned cannons into giant shotguns, spraying hundreds of small balls into packed formations. Explosive shells spread shrapnel in all directions, causing wounds that were almost impossible to treat. The bayonet was psychological torture made steel. 17 inches of triangular blade designed not just to kill, but to terrify. Most soldiers never actually used their bayonets in combat, but the threat of cold steel, the possibility of being run through, haunted everyone's nightmares. Medical equipment was medieval. Surgeons' tools were basically carpentry implements, saws, knives, probes. No anesthesia except alcohol and opium when available. No understanding of infection. No antibiotics. A minor wound could and often did lead to an agonizing death. Even basic equipment was designed wrong. Backpacks that destroyed spines, boots that destroyed feet, uniforms that provided neither warmth nor protection. It's as if everything was deliberately designed to increase suffering. Officers supposedly had it better than common soldiers, and in some ways they did. Better food, better quarters, horses to ride instead of marching. But they had their own unique forms of suffering. The pressure was immense. Officers were responsible for their men's lives, discipline, and effectiveness. A mistake could get hundreds killed. A failure could end not just your career, but your life. Courts-martial for officers often ended in execution. They were primary targets in battle. Enemy skirmishers specifically aimed for officers, knowing that removing leadership would cripple units. Officers had to stand upright and visible while their men could take cover. They had to project calm while bullets targeted them specifically. The social isolation was complete. They couldn't fraternize with their men without losing authority. They competed viciously with other officers for promotion. They were hated by civilians even more than common soldiers. They belonged nowhere. Many officers were promoted beyond their competence. The massive expansion of Napoleon's armies meant rapid promotion for anyone who survived. A lieutenant could become a colonel in 2 years if enough of his superiors died. These inexperienced officers made fatal mistakes that haunted them forever. The financial burden was crushing. Officers had to purchase their own uniforms, equipment, horses. They had to maintain appearances even when they hadn't been paid. Many went deeply into debt, borrowing against future pay that might never come. Cavalrymen thought themselves elite, and in some ways they were. They rode while others walked, they charged while others stood. They were the glamorous branch of service. But their suffering was unique and terrible. First, the horses. A cavalryman's life revolved around his mount. The horse needed 10 pounds of fodder and 10 gallons of water daily. On campaign, this was impossible to provide. Horses starved slowly, their ribs showing through their hides, their strength failing day by day. Watching your horse deteriorate was psychological torture. This animal was your partner, your survival, your identity as a cavalryman. When it died, and they died by the tens of thousands, you became just another foot soldier, but one wearing riding boots unsuitable for marching. The death rates for horses were appalling. In the Russian campaign, Napoleon started with 130,000 cavalry horses. Fewer than 2,000 survived. Most didn't die in battle, but from starvation, exhaustion, exposure, and disease. The fields of Europe were littered with equine skeletons. Cavalry charges, the supposed glory of mounted warfare, were usually disasters. Charging formed infantry squares was suicide. Horses wouldn't impale themselves on bayonets, so charges would swirl around squares, riders being picked off by musket fire. Even successful charges often resulted in cavalry being isolated and destroyed. The physical demands were extreme. Riding for hours in combat readiness destroyed backs and legs. The constant motion caused saddle sores that became infected. Cavalrymen developed permanent bow legs and spinal problems that crippled them in later life. Artillerymen were the technical specialists, often more educated than infantry or cavalry. They had to understand mathematics, physics, chemistry. But intelligence didn't protect them from suffering. The physical demands were crushing. Guns weighed tons and had to be manhandled across terrible terrain. When guns got stuck in mud, which was constantly, it could take dozens of men hours to free them. Artillerymen developed chronic injuries from constantly lifting ammunition and moving guns. The noise was literally deafening. Cannon fire at close range could rupture eardrums instantly. Even with cotton stuffed in their ears, artillerymen suffered progressive hearing loss. Many were completely deaf within a few years of service. They communicated through gestures and lip reading. The danger was constant. Artillery positions were primary targets for enemy counter-battery fire. A single lucky shot could detonate an ammunition wagon, killing entire gun crews instantly. Premature explosions, weapons failures, and accidents killed as many artillerymen as enemy action. The chemicals were toxic. Black powder produced sulphurous smoke that burned lungs and eyes. Mercury used in fuses caused neurological damage. Lead from handling ammunition caused chronic poisoning. Artillerymen aged rapidly, their bodies poisoned by their own weapons. The responsibility was overwhelming. A miscalculated range could result in firing on your own troops. A badly cut fuse could cause shells to explode among friends instead of enemies. Artillerymen lived with the knowledge that their mistakes killed not enemies but comrades. Military engineers had perhaps the most dangerous jobs in Napoleon's army. They built bridges under fire, dug siege trenches toward enemy walls, placed explosive charges, all while being specifically targeted by enemy sharpshooters who knew their value. Siege warfare was particularly hellish. Engineers would dig zigzag trenches toward fortified positions, getting closer each night. Enemy mortars would rain down continuously. Sorties would attack the trenches. Engineers worked knowing that every foot forward increased the likelihood of death. Bridge building in combat was suicide work. Engineers would stand waist-deep in freezing rivers, trying to anchor pontoons while enemy artillery targeted them. At the Berezina crossing, engineers worked in ice-filled water until they literally froze to death standing up. Mining operations involved digging tunnels under enemy fortifications to place explosive charges. Enemy counterminers would dig their own tunnels, leading to underground battles in absolute darkness. Men fought with knives and picks in spaces barely large enough to crawl through. The technical knowledge required meant engineers were often educated men who fully understood the dangers they faced. They could calculate precisely their chances of survival, usually depressingly low. This knowledge was its own form of torture. Men who'd gone into battle as eager young soldiers came out changed. They'd seen friends torn apart by cannon fire, held dying comrades as they bled out, and done things they never thought themselves capable of. Many turned to alcohol when they could get it, trying to forget what they'd seen and done. Not all suffering in Napoleon's army was equal. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite troops, had it significantly better than the regular line infantry. Better pay, better food, better equipment, and most importantly, better survival rates since they were held in reserve for crucial moments. But being elite came with its own unique miseries. The physical standards for the Guard were punishing. Minimum height requirements meant only the tallest men qualified. They had to have served with distinction, usually meaning they'd survived multiple campaigns where most of their comrades hadn't. They had to maintain perfect uniforms and equipment even on campaign, spending hours cleaning and repairing kit that would be filthy again within minutes of marching. The pressure was immense. The Guard was expected never to retreat, never to break, never to fail. The famous phrase, "The Guard dies but does not surrender," wasn't just a motto, it was a death sentence. At Waterloo, when the Guard finally broke, it shattered the morale of the entire army, because if the invincible Guard could break, what hope did anyone else have? The cavalry had their own special hell, caring for horses in impossible conditions. A cavalryman's life revolved around his mount. Horses needed 10 pounds of fodder and 10 gallons of water per day, impossible to provide on campaign. Watching your horse slowly starve while knowing your own survival depended on it was psychological torture. When horses died, and they died by the thousands, cavalrymen became infantry. For men who'd defined themselves by their mounted status, who'd looked down on foot soldiers, this was worse than death. Many requested transfer to any unit that still had horses rather than suffer the humiliation of walking. Artillery crews dealt with different challenges. Their guns weighed tons and had to be moved across the same terrible roads the infantry marched. When guns got stuck in mud, which was constantly, it could take hours and dozens of men to free them. Artillerymen developed chronic back problems from constantly lifting ammunition and moving guns. The technical demands were extreme, calculating range and elevation while under fire, cutting fuses to the exact length for explosive shells, maintaining rate of fire when your gun crew was being picked off by enemy skirmishers. One mistake could cause a gun to explode, killing its entire crew. Sappers and engineers were tasked with the most dangerous jobs, building bridges under enemy fire, digging siege trenches toward enemy fortifications, placing explosive charges. Their casualty rates were appalling. The joke was that sappers didn't need to worry about retirement planning. While not officially soldiers, thousands of women followed Napoleon's armies, and their suffering was often worse than the men's. These cantinières or vivandières sold food and drink to soldiers, did laundry, nursed the wounded, and provided what comfort they could in a world of constant brutality. Many were soldiers' wives who followed their husbands rather than face destitution at home. Others were widows of soldiers who had no other way to survive. Some were prostitutes, though the line between selling food and selling other comforts was often blurred by necessity. The army tolerated them because they provided essential services the military couldn't or wouldn't provide. These women marched the same distances as the soldiers, carrying their own supplies plus whatever goods they were selling. They had no official rations, surviving on what they could sell or what soldiers would share. When food was scarce, they were the first to go hungry. When danger threatened, they had no unit to protect them. In battle, they served as nurses, often going onto the battlefield while fighting was still happening to help wounded soldiers. They faced all the dangers of combat with none of the glory or recognition. Many were killed, their deaths unrecorded, their sacrifices forgotten. The pregnancy and childbirth situation was nightmarish. Women gave birth on the march, in camps, sometimes during battles. Infant mortality was extreme. Children who survived grew up in the army, learning to march before they could properly walk, seeing things no child should see. When armies retreated, women and children were often abandoned first. During the retreat from Moscow, thousands of women and children froze to death because they couldn't keep up with the desperate pace of withdrawal. Soldiers wrote heartbreaking accounts of passing frozen families, unable to help without dooming themselves. Sexual violence was endemic. While French military law technically protected women, enforcement was nearly impossible. Women had to attach themselves to particular soldiers or units for protection, trading companionship for safety. Those without protectors were vulnerable to assault from their own army, as well as enemies. The 1812 invasion of Russia deserves special attention. because it represents the absolute nadir of soldier suffering in Napoleon's army. What started as the grandest military expedition in history became an apocalypse that destroyed not just an army, but the men who comprised it. Over 600,000 men crossed into Russia in June 1812. Fewer than 100,000 made it back, and most of those were broken in body and spirit. It wasn't just a military defeat, it was a complete destruction of human beings on an industrial scale. The problem started immediately. Russia was simply too big. Maps were useless, showing roads that didn't exist, missing ones that did. The distances were beyond European comprehension. Soldiers would march for days through empty landscapes, seeing nothing but endless plains and forests. The psychological impact of such vastness was crushing. The summer heat was brutal. Temperatures soared above 35 degrees Celsius, 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and soldiers in wool uniforms designed for European climates began dropping from heat stroke. Water sources were scarce and often contaminated. Horses died by the thousands, their bloated corpses lining the march routes, adding to the stench and disease. The Russians employed scorched earth tactics, burning their own villages and crops rather than let the French use them. Wells were poisoned with dead animals, bridges were destroyed, nothing usable was left behind. The Grande Armée began starving in the middle of summer, months before the famous winter set in. Disease exploded through the ranks. Typhus, spread by the lice that infested every soldier, killed thousands. Dysentery weakened men until they couldn't march. Units that had started with 1,000 men were down to a few hundred before they ever saw combat. The medical corps was overwhelmed, then effectively ceased to exist. The Battle of Borodino in September was a bloodbath that solved nothing. 70,000 casualties in a single day, and the Russians simply retreated further. Moscow, the prize Napoleon had sought, was abandoned and then burned by the Russians themselves. The Grande Armée found itself occupying a charred ruin with winter approaching and no supplies. The retreat began in October, and with it came the cold. Not just cold, but temperatures that dropped to minus 35 degrees Celsius, minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Soldiers who had been carrying summer uniforms for months suddenly faced Arctic conditions. Men would gather around fires, and those who got too close would literally cook their frozen flesh without feeling it, only discovering the damage when they tried to walk. Frostbite was universal. Fingers turned black and fell off. Noses froze and broke away. Men's genitals froze, leading to injuries too horrible to describe. Soldiers would cut off their own frozen appendages with knives to prevent gangrene from spreading. The snow was littered with black fingers and toes like a grotesque breadcrumb trail. Horses died and were immediately butchered. When the horses were gone, soldiers ate leather, tree bark, and eventually each other. Cannibalism, though rarely admitted in memoirs, certainly occurred. Human bodies frozen in the snow were sometimes found with flesh cut away. Desperate men made desperate choices. The Cossacks harassed the retreating column constantly. They would sweep in, kill stragglers, and vanish into the snow. Any soldier who fell behind, even for a moment to relieve himself, was never seen again. Men learned to soil themselves rather than risk stepping out of formation. At the crossing of the Berezina River, the disaster reached its climax. The bridges broke under the weight of desperate humanity. Thousands drowned in the icy water. Others were crushed in the panic. Women and children were trampled underfoot. The river ran red with blood, then froze, creating a horrific monument to the disaster. Soldiers who survived described scenes from hell. Men gnawing on frozen corpses. Officers abandoning their units to save themselves. Friends killing each other for a crust of bread or a warmer coat. The bonds of civilization completely collapsed. It was every man for himself, and most men didn't make it.